Reading Scotland lectures are really on all different aspects of Scottish culture and Scottish politics, Scottish landscape, whatever. So when I was asked if I would deliver this presentation tonight, I thought, well, I'll talk about something that's very close to my heart and has taken up a great deal of my time recently, and is not unrelated to Scotland, because it's all about our national bard, Robert Burns. So I decided what I would do is talk a little bit about my work on the songs of Burns. Burns is a songwriter, as a publisher and editor of songs. And in so doing, talk a little bit about the projects of the Centre for Robert Burns Studies, which I've been so closely associated with, as Dominic said, since the noughties, and tell you a little bit more about them, and then we can hopefully open things up into a little bit more of a conversation. And I know that some of you here are Burnsians, some of you here are singers of Burns. I might be telling you things that you already know to some extent, but I hope I'll also be able to share some things that you maybe don't know quite as well, and lead you to some resources that we've developed that might be of interest moving forward. So I wanted to start just by telling a little bit about the Centre for Robert Burns Studies at the University of Glasgow, which was established in July 2007. And one of the reasons we decided to do this, to launch this centre or establish this centre, was because we looked at what was happening elsewhere in Scottish literature. At the University of Aberdeen, they were well underway with a new edition of the Edinburgh novels and the Waverley novels of Sir Walter Scott. And they were to establish a centre for the study of Walter Scott, which is still there with colleagues at the University of Aberdeen, where they're now working, in fact, on an Edinburgh University Press edition of Scott's long narrative, well, all of his poetry, but particularly those fantastic long narrative poems. Our colleagues at Stirling, in association with the University of South Carolina in Columbia in the States, were working on a collected works of James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd, which is now in its very final stages and will also be a multi-volume, and well over, I mean, probably nearly 40 volumes, actually. Hogg was so prolific. So they were doing that at Stirling. Our colleagues at the University of Edinburgh had started on a new scholarly edition of the novels of and other writing of Robert Louis Stevenson, one of the other great, international writers for Scotland. These are all international writers for Scotland. But actually, nobody was doing any work on Robert Burns, and nobody had done any significant work on Robert Burns in Scotland of that academic kind of work. And myself and one of my colleagues, Gerard Carruthers, at the University of Glasgow, who were working in Scottish literature, had both done research work as doctoral students on Burns. We were both quite passionate about him. But they'd also just appointed two titular chairs of English literature, our Regis Professor, Nigel Leask, and our Bradley Professor, Murray Pittock, both leading Romantic scholars who really were passionate also about Robert Burns. So it was a kind of no-brainer, really, as we would say. There was a gathering of scholars, there was a job needing to be done, and we decided we would establish a centre at Glasgow and see if we could embark on some projects around Robert Burns and his work and his legacy and his cultural position in Scotland. Burns is a very difficult character to deal with in lots of ways. He's over everything. Everybody knows him. Everybody can, you can stop people in the street in Scotland, show them a picture, and they will know that it's Robert Burns. But the academic world, and particularly the world of Romantic literature, taught him very much as a kind of strange regional voice, somebody who used an interesting language of the people, somebody who kind of inspired Wordsworth, but certainly not somebody to be seen in the same grouping as Keats or Shelley or Wordsworth or Byron. He wasn't really regarded in the same way in scholarly terms. And that's what we wanted to challenge significantly. We wanted to say, actually, Robert Burns is not just an iconic image for Scotland to sell whiskey and shortbread. Actually, he's a really stellar writer and should be seen alongside these other poets and Romantic writerly figures. So you can see here on this slide that we wanted to develop research and scholarship We wanted to develop some new teaching in the academy to teach students about Robert Burns and to actually teach beyond the university too. And we wanted to look also at a range of projects and support a range of projects around the 18th century, the long 18th century, the early 19th century, and related literature, but also to look at Burns's impact in other periods. And we'll maybe come back to that towards the end of the presentation. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. That's the one I wanted to show. So one of the things we wanted then to do was establish a real research backbone, something that was a major research activity. And we persuaded in 2011, or Jerry Carruthers, who's the general editor of this new edition, persuaded Oxford University Press that the time was ripe for us to do a new multi-volume edition of all of Burns's writing. Now, there was already an edition of the poems and songs in 3 volumes published in the 1960s by the wonderful literary editor James Kinsley. And there were already 2 volumes of songs published by Oxford, of letters, I beg your pardon, of the correspondence published in the 1980s, also by Oxford. But there were other aspects of Burns's work that had never been published before in a scholarly edition. There were lots of new letters. So since the 1960s, when you think about it, we've had the explosion of the internet and various other things. We've had it where we work now in a digital world. And Burns's manuscripts, and we can maybe talk about this later, I will come back to it at the end of the presentation, are literally all over the world. So being able to pull together these has allowed us, for example, to plan a new edition of the letters to and from Robert Burns, which will redate quite a lot of letters, which will introduce new correspondence into the picture. And as I'm going to talk about, we now, just in this presentation tonight, we chose to tackle the songs in a very different way. So in order to do this, we applied for 2 major grants from our UK Research and Innovation body, which is the big funding body for arts and humanities and other subjects, but the Arts and Humanities Research Council falls within UKRI. And between 2011 and just a couple of years ago, we've had 2 major grants. First of all, to edit the prose and songs, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight, and then to edit the correspondence and poetry, a project that's still underway. And this major funding allowed us to support the work of postdoctoral students. So we've had some fabulous postdocs coming through really in the last 10 years. We've been able to support younger colleagues who were new to textual editing, and a whole team of people are editing the correspondence just now. And those are colleagues who were very early in their career in 2011, but they're now established scholars in Scottish literature and in textual editing. So it's been a really very much a team effort. And again, I'll come back to that shortly too. So this major funding has allowed us so far to deliver the first 4 volumes of our new Oxford edition. You can see it here. The first volume pulled together Burns's commonplace books, his tour journals as Tour of the Borders and of the Highlands, and also a variety of other texts that had been associated with Burns, including things like the manual from his father about religious belief, which he used to educate his own children, other prose elements of, or contracts, other things that Burns published, with his own name attached. The commonplace books were still in manuscript. We had quite a job to actually get hold of the second commonplace book, which is still in private hands. The tour journals were available through John Murray Archive and other places. So as part of even just this first volume, we had to be networking with a number of different institutions and places where Burns's manuscripts are kept. And Nigel Leask had the wonderful job of annotating all of this and pulling it all together with his research assistant at that time, who was Dr. Pauline Mackay. Pauline is now the director of the Centre for Robert Burns Studies some considerable time later. So a real kind of wonderful professional trajectory for Pauline, but she cut her teeth as a research assistant on this particular volume. And then as part of that first phase, we also wanted to look at Burns's songs. Now, prior to this moment in time, Burns's songs had been edited in a variety of different ways. In 1903, James Dick produced one volume only looking at the songs, grouped them together thematically. It's a wonderful edition, actually, with really interesting information and a real understanding of Burns, the songwriter, but very much looking at the songs as texts with the melody lines, not looking at the wider musical context of the collections that Burns wrote songs for. And then James Kinsley in the 1960s, when he was doing his Oxford edition, had also brought in melodies. Again, his information on each of the songs really useful and interesting, but not really concerned with the musical milieu, the musical context of these songs. So what our new edition does is it takes Burns's songs very much in the context of the publications that in which they first appeared. And that's because Burns himself was very actively involved with the editors of these two collections. So what you can see here is the frontispiece for, or the front page, the title page for the Scots Musical Museum. And you can see here that it's instituted at Edinburgh, what he's talking about, the Catch Club. Underneath there, you see the name James Johnson. So Burns met James Johnson. I'll see if I can move this, minimise that. Burns met James Johnson on his famous visit to Edinburgh in 1786 and 7 at one of the gentlemen's clubs that he frequented when he was in the city. James Johnson was a publisher, a printer, who was particularly keen on printing music too, and using pewter plates rather than copper plates. This is at the time when music was either engraved or, in the case of Johnson's museum, was punched onto plates, and then the plates were rolled with ink and the pressing was then made. So they're beautiful handmade things, really. Even if a machine was doing it, somebody had to set it all up by hand. And Johnson had just embarked on the first volume of what he termed the Scots Musical Museum, which, rather than, I mean, museum suggests antiquities, very important in the 18th century, but it's also a sense of the gathering of the muses, I think, really Johnson was aiming at. He met Burns. He knew that he'd met somebody who was very interested in song culture, because Burns had published his first collection of poems and he'd included some songs in that collection. And Burns agreed to join Johnson in his quest. At the end of the day, this collection actually included 600 songs. And we really think, on terms of the editing, that well over 200 of those were collected, edited, or provided, presented, created by Burns. So he's regarded really as a kind of co-editor now of this major collection. So the Scots Musical Museum was edited in full by my colleague Murray Pittock. Came out in 2 volumes. One has got all the notes in it, one has got all the music in it. And I do have the volume here, which shows you roughly what size this was. So this was meant, I don't know if you can see that, but this was really meant to be almost a kind of pocket edition. And the musical arrangements, you'll see some of these in more detail on the slides I'm about to show you. But this was how it looked, and this was roughly the size it would have been. Okay, this was roughly the size it would have been. So these came out in 2017, revisited some of the songs that we've always associated with Robert Burns, where perhaps the evidence, archival evidence, suggests that maybe he didn't write them. There was a bit of a furore around My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose, which Murray suggested was actually as much the work of other people as it was by Burns. That didn't go down very well with the public. We could talk about that if you want to later on. But reinvestigating Burns's role, and the first ever scholarly edition of the Scots Musical Museum. This had appeared in the 19th century with notes by a wonderful antiquarian called William Stenhouse, notes that I still go back to often when I'm looking at the histories of songs. But in the modern period, it had never been edited. So a big kind of step forward for our understanding of Burns's songs. And then if I can, I don't know why that's not moving on. There we go. And the second collection is the one that I edited, Thomson's Select Collection of Original Scottish Airs. You can see the title page across on this slide. This is a really big, very complicated, long-lasting collection. So the 6 volumes of the museum appeared from 1787 until 1803. The last 2 volumes appeared just after Burns died, and obviously a few years after Burns died in 1796. Thomson's collection, the first volume of 25 songs, appeared in 1793. The second volume of 25 songs didn't appear until 1798, by which time Burns was 2 years dead. But Thomson continued to publish and republish and gather together and expand and add, do lots of things to these songs really across the next 50-year period. So as you can see on this title page, he is using Burns. If I move I don't know if you can see that, but if I move my little arrow, you can see that Burns appears on the title page. So he never meets Burns. They do talk about meeting in a pub between Edinburgh and Dumfries, but they never managed to do it, which is a great shame, I think. Thomson commissions not just Burns, but upwards of 30 men and women poets to provide lyrics or texts to songs. But Burns is by far his most important contributor and very much part of the branding and marketing of his volumes. And I'm going to come back and talk in a little bit more detail about that shortly. That's it appearing as volume 4 in the middle of COVID. So I was stuck at home. There was no launch event. There was an online thing that went on, but I mean, our plans to have some lovely performances to bring those songs alive with their wonderful musical arrangements that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, never happened. And that's me and my mum's front room when the box arrived from Oxford with the volumes in it. So it was a big moment. These songs, both collections of songs, again, never edited in this way. So looked at as songs, just poetry. And I've mentioned that past editors, James Kinsley, did at least put the melodies in there. But nobody had edited these songs the way we have done it in the context of this musical environment that Burns was moving in to write these songs, to collect them and to edit them for Johnson and for Thomson. And I always come back to these beautiful drawings from the Harden family notebooks at the National Library of Scotland. The Harden family lived in the new town of Edinburgh at the turn of the 19th century. And these are a variety of kind of home drawings of the family making music or what they did after dinner. So you can see backgammons there as well. There's somebody doing some sewing. You can see them playing by candlelight, but there's such evocative pictures of musical life, domestic musical life in Scotland at the beginning of the 19th century. And it's these kinds of people that Johnson was publishing his volumes for. Thomson was certainly publishing his volumes for. Okay, and this goes against a little bit of the kind of general idea of Burns as a songwriter, of somebody who was in the field, who was literally getting his hands dirty and who was listening to singers singing to him at local level. And I would really say that we're not undermining that element of Burns's story at all. What do we know about Burns and Burns's musical connections? Well, actually, a little, not gory detail, but a good bit of information. The woman who you can see on the right-hand side of this slide is Isabel Burns, or Isabel Begg, who was Burns's younger sister. And in the 1840s, she gave an interview to another musical editor, actually a big editor of Scots songs, George Farquhar Graham, and discussed really what she remembered about Burns's musicality and where that all came from. It's anecdotal evidence. It's in this manuscript, which was then published actually in the Victorian period. But what she manages to tell us, and the manuscript is actually at the Burns Birthplace Museum, hence the little picture there at the bottom of that slide. She says that Burns had some practical knowledge of music, enough for a man of his powerful intelligence to adapt words to music in a manner few others have been able to do, which rather contrasted with Burns's original teacher, John Murdoch. So Burns, and many of you will know this story, I'm sure, Burns and his brother and the sons of some other local farmers, tenant farmers in Ayrshire, kind of grouped together and paid for a tutor to educate their children, because a lot of the time they were spending time on the farm. Burns therefore received actually quite a special type of education. But John Murdoch, who was his tutor, remembers that it was really difficult to teach Burns and his brother the Psalms, and they had really bad ear for music. And he commented that Burns's voice was horrible to listen to, or words to that effect. But there's no doubt in my mind that Burns really did understand how a tune worked, because he couldn't write the text, the lyrics that he wrote to match tunes. And we'll come to that in a second, without that knowledge, I think. So she says, no, he was able to adapt words to fit music, that he could read music printed or written, and he played from printed airs. She didn't know who wrote airs for Burns, but I think our research has shown that the vast majority of those tunes came from printed collections of fiddle tunes, less so pipe tunes, bagpipe tunes, but mostly fiddle tunes, that were published so many times in the 18th century. Okay, one particular collection that was absolutely one that Burns kept close to his pocket, and used that. So he could read music. He played the fiddle, but she doesn't remember anyone dancing to his playing, which I think is really important, because that suggests to me that he couldn't play a tune and keep a tempo going, or a rhythm going, or a beat, a measure going that would allow people to dance to it. So he could pick tunes out, but maybe not play quite as fluently as he would have liked to have played. But she also says that he attended a singing school before they left Loch Lee, which was really the farm where Burns was a young man, and attended a singing school again when he was in Mauchline and the family moved to the farm of Mosgiel. So it suggests to me that he's plugged in and understands music, wants to know more about music, has self-taught or has learnt how to read music a little bit, even how to play a wee bit. They talk about him having a stock and horn. They talk about him also having a guitar, having owned a guitar. So somebody who was willing to have a bit of a go. But we also know from correspondence that frequently people came to play tunes to him, or to let him hear tunes from a new collection that he might have found in passing and wanted to hear tunes from. So there's definitely a little bit of musicality there, but also, support from others to learn about music. How do we know that he is connected with the melodies or connected with music? We know that from the first publication of his poems. So the book that made Burns really famous was Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect, published in Kilmarnock in 1786. It was published by subscription by John Wilson in Kilmarnock. But it really was so well reviewed. It was the famous review by Henry Mackenzie, which doffed Burns the heaven-taught ploughman. It was then picked up and subscribed to for a second Edinburgh edition in 1787. So it was very much Burns's calling card. This is the point at which he could have gone to Jamaica, but the result of the success of this small publication in the west of Scotland really, the rest of history sort of set itself going because of this publication. And you can see here on the last page of the contents that he was also keen to include some songs. So even in this first collection, he's identifying himself as someone interested in song culture. Here, for example, is his song, It Was Upon a Lammas Night, or Nicht, if you want. It's just called Song, and the next one on the page to the right-hand side here, you'll see is also Now Westland Winds, one of the songs he wrote when he was just in his teens. Phenomenal song for a teenager to write, still regarded by many people as their most beloved of Burns' songs, Now Westland Winds. But you'll see also here that he calls them just Song, but he also includes the name of a tune underneath that heading. When I'm teaching my students about these songs, I often say, well, these are traditional songs, these are traditional tunes, these are very often fiddle tunes, or they might be known to a song that's generally already quite popular. So it's the equivalent of saying these words are to the tune Strawberry Fields, or the tune Hey Jude, or something much more hip nowadays, to Annie Lennox or to whatever. And students then kind of understand that these are tunes that people hum, they're tunes that people know in their day-to-day business, so they would understand that this was a tune that they could sing along to and that Burns was writing words for. So in the case of Corn Rigs Are Bonny, Burns writes this new love song for this tune that is already established. Quite often, Burns is picking up these things from other publications. So he's interested in tunes, as I've said. One of the big tune collections that he worked with was published in the middle of the century, and produced by a fiddler and musician called James Oswald. It was called Oswald's Pocket Companion, the Caledonian Pocket Companion, and Burns, had that on his person. I mean, quite often carried it with him. But this song has Corn Rigs Are Bonny has a song that goes right back to the work of Allan Ramsay earlier in the 18th century. Burns mentions Ramsay's work. He knows it. He talks about it in his correspondence. He mentions it, I think, in his biographical letter to John Moore, the writer John Moore. And this song dates back to Ramsay's Gentle Shepherd, which was a ballad opera he wrote in the 1720s. It was a hugely popular piece of theatre work. It appeared in numerous editions across the 18th century. We don't know which edition Burns used or knew, but a lot of the songs were picked up by a London publisher called William Thomson and made into a sort of songbook without Ramsay's permission. So he's very angry about this, and it's quite entertaining actually to read how annoyed he was about Thomson picking out his songs without him asking. But Corn Rigs was the finale of the Gentle Shepherd, sung by the beautiful Peggy, the shepherdess, at the end about Patey, the shepherd who she falls in love with, the gentle shepherd, indeed. So this is a tune that had been well established. It was a bit of a pop song in its own day, and so this one goes something like, my Patey is a lover gay, his mind is never muddy, his breath is sweeter than you hay, his face is fair and ruddy, his shape is handsome middle size, he's stately in his walking, the shining o' his een surprise, 'tis heaven to hear him talking. And if you go back to Burns takes this kind of love song or this theme, but turns it into something a little bit different. But again, it would be to the same tune. It was upon a Lammas night, or nicht, when corn rigs are bonny, beneath the moon's unclouded licht, I held a waughty Annie. The time flew by with tentless heat, till tween the late and early, with small persuasion she agreed to see me through the barley. And if you look to the end, you'll see that there's a chorus for the song. So Burns creates a chorus for everybody to join in with. You can sing along. Corn rigs and barley rigs, and corn rigs are bonny, I'll ne'er forget that happy night, nicht amang the rigs wi' Annie. Okay, and it's a beautiful song actually, where typically of Burns, he creates this beautiful atmosphere of a moonlit night. The sky was blue, the wind was still, the moon was shining clearly. I set her doon wi' richt goodwill amang the rigs o' barley. I kent her heart was all my ain, I looed her maist sincerely. I kissed her hour and hour again among the rigs o' barley. So he has this beautiful way of creating that atmosphere of the moonlit night. And then he has that lovely way towards the end of the song where he reflects on how important love is. I hae been blithe with comrades dear, I've been, happy with my friends. I hae been merry drinking. I hae been joyful gathering gear. I hae been happy drinking. And then he says, so all these lovely things that he's enjoyed doing, but all the pleasures ere I saw, though 3 times doubled fairly, that happy nicht was worth them all among the rigs o' barley. So he puts everything into a much bigger kind of life context about the importance of love, all inspired by Alan Ramsay in the first place. And one of the things that I loved about working on the Thomson project was that I found this fabulous manuscript in the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. I had the wonderful opportunity of going to see these manuscripts in the flesh, although we'd been working with pictures from them. So this is my very hazy picture from New York. But the manuscripts were all in plastic or in covers, so that's why you can see all these shadows. But it's a wonderful quotation about the importance of tunes for Burns. And he says, you can see it just 3 lines down, until I'm a complete master of a tune in my own singing, such as it is, and if we believe John Murdoch, it was rubbish, I never can compose it. My way is, or for it, my way is, I consider the poetic sentiment correspondent to my idea of the musical expression. Then choose my theme, begin one stanza. When it is composed, which is generally the most difficult part of the business, I walk out, sit down now and then, look out for objects in nature around me that are in unison or harmony with the cogitations of my fancy and workings of my bosom. Humming, we just don't write like this anymore, do we? Humming every now and then the air, that's the melody, with the verses I have framed. When I feel my muse beginning to jade, I retire to the solitary fireside of my study and there commit my effusions to paper, swinging at intervals on the hind legs of my elbow chair, which we tell our children not to do, of course, by way of calling forth my own critical strictures as my pen goes on. Seriously, he says, this at home is almost invariably my way. And what I've left out there is the very end of that letter when you see what damned egotism, he says, and then he scores damned out. This is in a letter to Thomson. He's very careful about his mode of expression to Thomson, who's a civil servant and somebody who works within the kind of literati of Edinburgh. Burns, it's really interesting reading the letters from them. He's often very forceful, but I do always smile when I look at the end of that letter. So it's a wonderful letter written early on in his correspondence with Thomson. Of course, there's a bit of poetic license here. We are dealing with a poet after all, but it is the most wonderful description of how the melody really determines the poetic sentiment of what Burns wants to do, as well as setting the rhythm, the meter, the stresses of the lines. It is part and parcel of a process that is as much an understanding of the musical as it is, a creative process simply to do with words. And I think that's really important for us to remember in the context of Burns, the songwriter. This is an example then of Burns doing a list of songs for Johnson's Musical Museum. This is a manuscript from the Hasty manuscript at the British Library, which is where a lot of the manuscripts and scribbles and of the songs for the museum are. Practically none of them in that manuscript have musical notation on them. We found 2 or 3 examples of what we think is Burns's hand with writing musical notation, but it's a very rare thing. In fact, it's usually just the names of the tunes and then the texts that he's written to match them. But here you can see a list of songs, and you can see some times where he's talking Tibby Dunbar tune is Johnny McGill, or as I on an eminence stood amusing tune or an Goyle, and a kind of Gaelic tune, not a kind of, it is a Gaelic tune, sort of halfway down. You can see Greensleeves in there. You would have thought, well, Greensleeves, surely that's an English song, but Burns does write a text for that tune. Then down below, right at the bottom of that slide, you can see Call the Yows to the Nows, Burns's very famous shepherding song, the music with Mr. Clark. That's Stephen Clark, the musician who was responsible for writing the arrangements or giving a bass line to play with the tunes in the Scots Musical Museum. We'll see that shortly. I loo no nae laddie but yin. The music was Mr. Clark. So you can see how he's kind of piecing together the names of tunes, telling Johnson what the tune is so that Johnson can perhaps go off and find a version of it. If you look right back up to the top of this manuscript, you see, my love, she's but a lassie yet. Can you see that? Just second down. And then there's a long line. Burns is great with these long kind of flourishes. And it says aired. And you think, well, what on earth is that? So what that is a collection of airs by James Aird. And he's suggesting then that Johnson might go and seek the tune from one of Aird's collections. Okay, so this is a digital copy available from the wonderful National Library of Scotland online musical sources. And you can see that it comes from a selection of Scotch, English, Irish, and foreign airs adapted to the fife or the pipe, violin, or German flute. Okay, it's sold Glasgow. It's sold in Glasgow, printed by James Aird. This is just one of many collections of tunes that Aird published. There's a real suggestion here that dance music is important. A lot of Burns's songs are written to dance tunes. But here you can see it. There's My Love, She's But a Lassie Yet. That's the tune that Burns is talking about. And then you can see how it then translates itself into song number 225 in the Scots Musical Museum, published by Johnson, where you've got Burns's wonderful, funny words, comic words to this, often thought of as a love song, often referred to as a love song for whiskey. And it's a great dance tune. My love, she's but a lassie yet. My love, she's but a lassie yet. We'll let her stand a year or twa. She'll no be half sae saucy yet. I rue the day I saw her, oh. I rue the day I saw her, oh. Whoops. Wha gets her needs nae say he's wooed, but he may say he's bought her, oh. Come draw a drap o' the best o' it yet, come draw a drap o' the best o' it yet. Gae seek for pleasure where ye will, but here I never missed it yet. We're a' dry wi' drinking o' it, we're a' dry wi' drinking o' it. The minister kissed the fiddler's wife, he couldna preach for thinking o' it. So a lovely kind of skipping dance-like tune, and there you have it. Burns suggesting Aird's collection, Johnson picking up on that and pulling it together with Burns's wonderful new words. Gives you a really good sense. Here's another example from the Scots Musical Museum. Then I'm going to move on to talk about Thomson a little bit more. This is an old harper tune, Rory Dahl's Port, which appeared was a well-known Gaelic harp tune during the 18th century. Burns was particularly invested in this tune and wrote his wonderful love song for Clorinda, Agnes MacLehose. It's regarded now really as one of Burns's most favouriteest songs. Some of you, I'm aware, were at the ScotFest concert that I did, and we sang a variety of different tunes that are known to go with this song. But it's a very beautiful tune, and the tune really sets, it's a very good example, this song. I often use it for teaching because it's a very good example of how the tune sets the poetic sentiment and how the tune also dictates dictates the length of Burns's lines, but in this case also suggests to Burns the rhythm or the rhyming scheme for the rhythm, but also the rhyming scheme for this particular song. So if we look at the last verse, which is the one down on the right-hand side, the tune is very beautiful, but it's a very repetitive tune, and you'll see how Burns works with that repetition and that rhyming scheme very effectively, I think. So if I was just to sing the last verse, fare thee weel, thou first and fairest, fare thee weel, thou best and dearest. So almost exactly the same. Thine be ilka joy and treasure, peace, enjoyment, love and pleasure. A fond kiss, and then we sever. A farewell, alas, forever. Deep in heart-wrung tears I'll pledge thee, warring sighs and groans I'll wage thee. It's a really beautiful tune, but you'll also see that the very last 4 lines of the last verse balance beautifully with the first 4 lines of the first verse. So again, he uses those first 4 lines to really bookend the song as well, but he uses the lower part of the melody to introduce it, and the higher part, of potentially more expressive part of the melody, to complete the song with a repetition almost exactly of those words, apart from the word alas, which makes that really important in the final verse. Okay, and I could spend a whole hour actually just looking at this song, but we're not going to do that because we need to move on. So Thomson's collection, which is the collection I work on, Thomson's an entirely different character from Johnson. For a start, we've got pictures of him. We know something about his life. We have no picture of James Johnson that we've yet been able to identify, and we know practically nothing about Johnson's biography. So it's the complete opposite. Thomson is a little bit vilified. I have been known to include this image on the left, this beautiful watercolor image of Thomson with horns and shades on. I've just photoshopped it because he is not regarded with the same affection in the Burns world as Johnson is, and we can maybe talk a little bit about that later on. So Thomson then publishes Burns, and I mentioned, mostly posthumously. He uses Burns very much to brand his big collection of his select collection of original Scottish airs. I wanted to show you, I managed to persuade Oxford to include this image in the new edition, in fact, because this image I just think is a fabulous image of Burns. It's also engraved by Thomson's brother, Peyton Thomson, who was it was a really significant engraver during that time. But of course, a lot of the time we don't know who these people are. We don't really know how famous a number of these people are. But Peyton Thomson is very important at the time. I think it's a beautiful stipple engraving. So I hope on the slide you can see the details, because it is the most beautiful thing. And I wanted to show you, just in comparison to I don't even know if you can see that, the size of this. It's kind of from my chin halfway down my stomach, really. And this is one of Thomson's folio volumes, so a very different scale from the volumes of Johnson, which were much cheaper to buy and much more portable. These guys were for people who could, they were significantly expensive. But I wanted to show you this one that dates from the 1830s. And if I can just open it at the right place, you'll see the very illustration that's on the slide. Okay, with lovely tissue paper to keep it all right. And on the right-hand side, you can see this wonderful little vignette that appeared on all of Thomson's title pages. Now see where Caledonia's genius mourns and plants the holly round the tomb of Burns. And I often use that to talk about the way in which Thomson's collection really memorializes Burns, much like the 19th century editions of Burns's life and works. He's kind of literally on that urn. His face is on his head is on that urn. And it's a very classical image in lots of ways, very much looking backwards to Burns's own time, but it's actually a vignette that appears right the way through to the 1850s. Okay, and it's quoting from a lovely poem by Anne Grant of Laggan, actually, who's one of the women songwriters that Thomson commissions and does much to advertise and promote her work. In fact, it's a couplet taken from one of Anne Grant's poems about Burns, written after his death. Okay, so quite interesting way. Thomson's collection differs from Johnson musically in quite a major way, which we'll come to in a second. And this is an example or an extract from an essay that Thomson wrote later in 1840 for a big book called The Land of Burns, published by the Glasgow publisher Blackie and Sons, where he recounts why he went ahead to why he wanted to create his collection in the first place. And it tells us that he listened to Italians, including this very beautiful man on the slide here, Giusto Ferdinando Tenducci, who was the famous castrato, touring castrato of the moment. So a very ethereal kind of quality of voice, a male soprano voice, really. He sang, other Italians sang, and for the concerts of the Edinburgh Musical Society. And Thomson was a clerk. He didn't go to all of the concerts of the Musical Society, but he did have access to some of them. And he remembers vividly hearing these Italian singers singing Scots songs. And he loved this kind of cosmopolitan atmosphere that they brought to what were his native airs, his native tunes and native songs. And he talks about some of them in this particular quotation. And this pushed him then to think about who he might like to invite to do musical arrangements for his collection. So this is Pleyel. People don't know Ignaz Pleyel nowadays, but Pleyel was one of Joseph Haydn's very famous pupils. I'm going to show you a picture of Haydn in a minute. Haydn was Thomson's favourite composer of the moment. He really wanted to ask him first, but he was quite a big name at that time. He'd been in London. He'd been lauded in London with all his new symphonies. Thomson was a bit unsure about contacting him, so he contacted Pleyel first. He then commissioned Leopold Kozeluch, a Bohemian composer in Vienna, using the contact of somebody in the British legation in Vienna, who he got to know through his clerking job. And that's another story altogether. Then he plucked up the courage to ask Haydn, and Haydn eventually produced hundreds of arrangements for Thomson. He moved on to Beethoven, and we're going to hear a little bit of Beethoven in just a minute or two, if we've still got time, which I think we just have. Karl Maria von Weber, somebody who was very interested in folk songs of his own native Germany, collected some of those on the Rhine. And when he was a young man, travelled up and down the Rhine with a guitar to collect some of those, if rumour has it, has to be believed, and Johann Nepomuk Hummel. So a variety of really quite established European composers were sent melodies by Thomson. They arranged the melodies usually for voice and piano and violin and cello, sometimes for German flute, and sent them back to Thomson. And as I mentioned earlier, really these collections were aiming for this kind of clientele. You can see some photographs of this good old Kate Winslet in Emma Thompson's fabulous screenplay based on Sense and Sensibility. One of my favourite films, actually. I have a bit of a soft spot for that one. One of the Hardin drawings in the middle, and another kind of, period sort of Georgian arrangement with a square piano, which was very much the kind of instrument of the moment, especially in a growing middle class environment where folk could afford a piano, where they were maybe wanting to learn how to sing and had some singing lessons, very much that kind of audience. As part of our big project, because we were lucky enough to be funded, I worked with 11 young musicians, all interested in period performance and playing square pianos or harpsichords, and playing stringed instruments with gut strings, so very much as they would have been in the 18th century, and a whole group of singers from the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland who were interested in period performance. The singer there, Clare, who you can see with the red head there, it was from the National Youth Choir of Scotland, others from the University of Glasgow Chapel Choir. And we brought them together for a series of workshops where we brought in specialist performers to sort of explore these. We talked about what a singing lesson would have involved, what they might have been wearing and how that might have, affected their breathing. And then we took them to Pollock House, a beautiful 18th century house in Glasgow, thanks to the National Trust for Scotland. And we performed in these spaces that were 18th century spaces, and we made recordings of 25 songs from Johnson's Museum and Thomson's Select Collection. And I wanted to let you hear one of them. I've got a couple of things I wanted to let you hear before I finish. But I wanted to let you hear one of Beethoven's settings of a Jacobite song called The Lovely Lass of Inverness, which Thomson published in 1818, which was the first volume that had Beethoven's arrangements in it. And this is to let you hear these young musicians kind of grappling with this for the first time. And do let me know that you can hear this, okay? Because I don't want you to miss it. Very atmospheric. Okay, so I'm going to try and go back to these slides. Can you see that slide okay? Somebody, Dominic or somebody,
yes,
just
yes, we
let
can
me
see
know you can. Good. Yeah, so there's a wonderful online resource which we built where we give information about the 25 songs that we recorded, information about the young performers, information about the workshops. We interviewed them as they learned about Burns's songs and, you know, reflecting on what they'd learned and how difficult things were or how challenging they found the Scots language. Some of the group knew about Burns, and one came from Ayrshire. The girl you heard sing is now a very famous Scottish soprano called Beth Taylor. And if you get a chance to hear her sing, please go and hear her because she's something quite special. She represented Scotland in the Cardiff Singer of the World recently. She's just performed at Glyndebourne for the first season. She is a truly exciting. She's a real star actually, and I knew she was something special when she took part, but all of the singers involved, some knew about Burns and came from Ayrshire. Some had never heard about Burns. So it was a wonderful opportunity to introduce the younger generation of performer to these songs and to explore them. And I thought I knew them quite well over the years, but actually I learned a lot from working with those young performers. It was a real joy and one of the highlights of the project for me. Some of the other things we were able to do, and I'm kind of moving towards the conclusion of the paper now, some of the other things we were able to do because of this wonderful funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So we were able to put on a performance of Burns's cantata, The Jolly Beggars. The first modern performance that we were aware of was music by the English theatre composer Henry Bishop. And you can see this. So in that volume that included The Lovely Lass of Inverness with Beethoven's first arrangements, The second part of that volume in 1818 included this new musical setting, a sort of London theatre version, as it were, of Burns's cantata The Jolly Beggars. Now, until this time, and this is 1818, this cantata, which is now regarded as one of Burns's masterpieces, had never appeared in print with music, and it had only appeared in print once in a kind of collection of Burns's works that was kind of scholarly. It had appeared without Burns's name on it in pamphlet form, in chapbook form, in the late 1790s. It never appeared in print during Burns's lifetime. Hugh Blair in Edinburgh thought it was a bit too racy. Very much involves the low life of a pub, talking about their life experiences. But actually, it really turns out to be one of the finest of Burns's pieces of work. And it's now regarded as really, we're just sorry you didn't live longer and get a chance to write more drama, because really it's something special. So I had come across this when I was doing my PhD. I had always wanted to hear it performed, and this wonderful project and funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council allowed us to do that. And actually, you can watch that performance that we recorded, a performance with professional singers, with our chapel choir, who are wonderful. And we just had such fun putting this together. But I was really, really surprised at how good it was. I thought it would be very period and very much sort of, Henry Bishop, and you hear it once and that's fine. But on the contrary, it actually works really well. And we've since performed it in London at the British Library for the 150th anniversary of the Burns Club of London. And that was in 2018, I think. And we've then performed it since in Glasgow again, and the Scottish Opera Community Choir took it on as their sort of piece to learn this year. So this last year we've had performances by the Scottish Opera Community Choir in Glasgow too. So it's just been a wonderful thing to bring that back to life, really. And one of the other wonderful things that I'm very proud of doing is a set of, again, of just over 20 choral settings by Robert Burns. So myself and my former teacher Marjorie Rycroft, who has edited the Haydn Thomson songs for the big international Haydn edition, she and I wrote a chapter on Burns, the European influence of Burns, musically speaking, and found all these wonderful choral arrangements that we just didn't know how they sounded. And so I spoke to Katie Cooper, our wonderful choir director, at the chapel choir at Glasgow, and said, let's see if we could find some money to pull together a web resource that actually, and you can perform these wonderful songs and we can make them available. And so we were able to produce this in 2011. We've got a whole set of composers here. That's not. I've just come out of the wrong place. Just bear with me. Oh, always happens, doesn't it? Yeah, here we go. You can see you can browse through the composers or browse through the songs themselves. And I wanted to let you hear. I know we don't really have time to play all of it because time is very much wrapping up now, but I want to let you hear just the very beginning of Katie's own arrangement of Burns's "A Man's a Man for All That." Now, again, some of you who were at the ScotFest will have heard this because we ended our concert with it, but it's such a wonderful recording, such a wonderful piece, and I just wanted to let you maybe hear the very beginning of it, arranged by Katie and performed by the chapel choir for this wonderful project. So I'm gonna let you come back to explore those a little bit more in your own time, because it's time's moving on. I want to just finish off by talking a little bit more broadly about the Centre for Robert Burns Studies. We've been so lucky. This project, the choral project, was actually funded internally at Glasgow by our Chancellor's Fund, who also helped the chapel choir, supported them to come to London for the performance of the Jolly Beggars that we did for the London Burns Club and the British Library. So they've been very supportive of us going forward. There's a few other things I wanted to mention just before I finish. A project highlight for me was I mentioned visiting the Pierpont Morgan Library to look at Burns's correspondence, his letters to George Thomson, which I got the chance to do. 56 letters from Burns to Thomson still existing, bought by Pierpont Morgan, with a whole batch of other manuscripts, including manuscripts by Mary Queen of Scots, shipped across to New York in 1919. And it's included over 100 texts for songs that Thomson then went on to publish. So it was an opportunity for us to look at the changes that Thomson made, what he received from Burns, what he then published, which is all part of the scholarly process of a scholarly textual edition, which is what we produced. But it was a really amazing opportunity to see these things in the flesh. We'd been working with an old microfilm. My research assistant, Jerry McKeever, had gone through and, painstakingly pulled out all the texts, and I had the job of going and checking in them against the real thing. And it was really wonderful. And during that visit, I visited Burns, of course, in Central Park, only to find that the Piano in the Park project was sitting right beneath him, and children were playing tunes right at his foot. And I took this picture and thought, my goodness, I wish I had a wee hotline to Burns, because I think he would be pretty chuffed to see that process in action. So that was a wee bit of a highlight for me. One of the things about having a wonderful research centre with a real team of people, early career, doctoral, master's students, postdoctoral students, doctoral students, young colleagues through to experienced academics, is that we've been able to do so many different things. So our website, which I've given you a link to here, shows all the kind of past projects that we've done. We've done work on the publication of Burns's texts just after his death and up until the early 19th century. The Romantic National Song Network is there. It was Burns was part of that too. My colleague Murray Pittock did a fantastic and really useful report for the Scottish Government on Burns's value to the Scottish economy, which has actually generated a number of different projects that are now connected with the Centre for Robert Burns. We've done a project looking at Burns's legacy in objects and in statues. That was one of the early projects we did. We've received gifts. The Agnes Burns, her book, is a songbook which we think may have belonged to one of Burns's nieces, and that's now, we've done a little bit of work, so there's a lovely little resource on that. We've edited the letters of James Curry, Burns's first biographer, with famous biography from 1800, because a whole batch of his correspondence is at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. I've got a Jacobite officers database. There's other things the wonderful archive of Jean Redpath, the great folk singer who spent a great deal of her time recording Burns's tunes as they appeared in the Scots Musical Museum, generously donated her books about Burns and her recordings that she made to us as a centre. So there's a whole load of different things. You can go on and have a look. I can only just touch on them just now. And at the moment, we're still completing the Editing Burns project for Oxford. My colleague Rona Brown is undertaking a wonderful project to re-edit the works of Robert Fergusson, Burns's great muse, his elder brother in the muse, who has a big 250th anniversary this year. The collected works of Alan Ramsay, who I mentioned right back at the start, has now completed. That was another big AHRC project. And our Shaw funding from our great benefactors, Frank and Susan Shaw in the States, has helped us to undertake a Burns Supper project. And we're not really finished that yet, but that's looking at this kind of thing that is the Burns Supper, another story altogether. So you can have a look at those resources on our website. In February 24, I'm thrilled to say we were awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize for Higher Education, Higher and Future Education, for the sustained work we've done on Burns. at Glasgow since 2007. That's the team outside the back door to Buckingham Palace. In February, we went down to receive the medal. 22 institutions were awarded, and that's a process that happens every 2 years. And we were the only arts and humanities project to be awarded out of the 22 projects. So a really big deal for us as a centre. Please visit our website. Our Editing Robert Burns for the 21st Century has its own website where you'll find the Performing Burns project and some other things too. Our main website will give you access to Burns's choral settings and other things. And we run some online courses too. We have a 3-week MOOC, a massive open online course that's free to do, which we run in January and July, so around the birthday and around the death day. And we also have a deeper, longer 12-week course that we run on poems, songs, and legacy of Robert Burns if you were interested in learning some more. But that's enough, more than enough from me this evening. But thank you so much for your attention. I hope while going over some things that some of you might have heard before, as I said at the start, you might have learned a little bit more about Burns and about our centre too. So thank you very much for listening.